The U.S. Army and Wehrmacht versus the SS. Epic horse. VIP rescue mission Operation Cowboy, hunkered down in their positions. US Army Captain Thomas M. Stewart surveyed the motley assortment of men under his command. Some were from Poland, Britain, and France. Others hailed from as far afield as Yugoslavia, Russia, and there were even a few New Zealanders for good measure. To an outside observer, though, by far the most surprising thing was the sight of German Wehrmacht soldiers fighting alongside American soldiers. What followed was one of the strangest and most beautiful operations of the Second World War. But first, a bit of backstory. Originating from the Habsburg Empire, the White Lepizzaner is a rare breed of show horse that's world-renowned. Prized for their beauty, grace, and temperament, their bloodline can be traced back more than 400 years. It was this purity that brought them to the attention of the Nazis. You see, they weren't just interested in making Aryan humans by crossbreeding Lipizzaners with other pure-blooded breeds. They also hoped to make a super race of Aryan horse. This bizarre program first got underway when they transferred all of the Lepizzaner female horses to a specialized farm in hostile Czechoslovakia after the German conquest of Austria in 1938. They would stay right until the last months of World War II. By then, Czechoslovakia was in a bit of a complicated place because the Germans were definitely going to lose the war. The Allied leaders were already dividing up the spoils of the collapsing Third Reich. Crucially, at the Yalta Conference of February 1945, they had all agreed to let the Soviet Union take over Czechoslovakia when the hostilities ended. Because of this, by April 1945, the Soviet Red Army was stationed 40 miles east of Hostau, waiting for the signal to advance into Czechoslovakia. But the Americans were also around too. They were posted a bit closer, 20 miles west of Hostau, waiting for orders to liberate Prague. Stuck in the middle were the German veterinary officers of the Wehrmacht, the armed forces branch of the Nazi war machine. They had been caring for the majestic white Lipizzaners for the whole conflict, and they were seriously worried about them, because the Russians didn't give a damn about horses. Their anxieties were wholly justified. The Soviets had already destroyed another prized equine collection, the Royal Hungarian Lipizzaners, earlier in the war. Instead of being looked after, these elegant creatures had either been shot or worked to death like common pack horses. The Wehrmacht vets knew that when the Red Army came rolling in, their precious animals would suffer the same humiliating fate. This put the German commanders of the farm in a tricky position. The most senior of them, Lieutenant Colonel Holters, was actually a member of a mysterious German Intel Air Force unit. He'd ended up in Hostau by chance when his unit had run out of fuel and became stranded. While there, he had befriended the facility's ranking Wehrmacht officer, Lieutenant Colonel Rudowski, and both men had quickly bonded over their common love of horses. When the word of the Soviet invasion came in, Holters tried to convince his friend to hand over the mares to the Americans. Initially, Rudowski agreed. But at the last minute, compelled by a sense of loyalty to the fatherland, he changed his mind. Holters, on the other hand, didn't care about his oath. All he cared about was the survival of the White Lipizzaners, and so, in secret, he made contact with the Americans to the Thayer. The unit he encountered there was the 42nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Cavalry Group of the Troy Corps of the 12th Corps of General George Patton's Third Army. It was commanded by Colonel Charles M. Reed, a Virginian gentleman well known for his love of polo, and many of its members were experienced horsemen. Despite technically being enemies, their shared affinity for horses united them, and a rescue plan involving an unlikely partnership of Americans and Germans began to take shape. The operation was not simple by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it was incredibly complex, with lots of unpredictable factors. First, while the Wehrmacht officers at Hostau were friendly, The hordes of German troops patrolling the region were not. They hadn't been informed of the secret mission, so they were going to shoot when they saw Americans striking into their territory. In addition to this, most of the battle-hardened troops of the 42nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, completely worn out by 9 months of brutal fighting, just wanted to go home and didn't want to risk their lives again. A third complication was the fact that many of the horses were pregnant, and some had just given birth. In the meantime, the Soviet Red Army could advance at any moment. With the clock ticking, General George Patton approved the plan and ordered his men to make it quick. Unable to allocate enough men or resources, only 2 small cavalry reconnaissance units and just a few scraps of armor were scrambled for the mission leaders, Colonel Reed and Major Andrews. In total, just 325 men, 5 small M24 Chaffee light tanks, a pair of howitzer motor carriages, and a handful of machine-gun-armed jeeps and M8 armored cars were expected to strike into a region defended by tens of thousands of German troops that were backed up by 2 panzer divisions. Operation Cowboy. On April 28, 1945, Operation Cowboy got going with a massive artillery strike that smashed a hole in the German front line. The Americans poured into the breach and valiantly fought village to village against stiff opposition. By some sort of miracle, they actually managed to advance 20 miles to the farm. When they arrived, both commanders sprung into action. While Colonel Reed rounded up enough vehicles to evacuate the horses, Major Andrews entrusted his deputy, Captain Stewart, with defense. This would be the toughest test of his military career. Stewart had only been left with 180 men, and the news was that an SS regiment was en route to wipe them and the horses out. More bodies were needed. And they were needed fast. At first, the captain armed the small band of prisoners of war found at the facility, a mixture of Brits, New Zealanders, French Poles, and Yugoslavs with captured German weapons. He then further bolstered his ranks with a column of anti-communist Russian Cossacks, whose leader was a former prince. 4 years earlier, they had actually sided with the Nazis after Hitler's invasion of Russia. But now that the Soviets were closing in, they were keen to escape, even if it meant having to fight alongside their former enemies. Finally, Stewart asked the Wehrmacht Colonel Rudowski if he'd like to join them. There was one catch. He would only agree to arm them if they pledged allegiance to the United States. Faced with an almost certain death at the hands of the Soviets, Rudowski and his men, many of whom also had no love for the Nazis, took up the offer and fell in line with the American. Now, all that was left to do was to... Before long, the field in front of the farm was enveloped in gunfire as the unlikely Foreign Legion, jokingly called themselves Stewart's Foreign Legion, were assaulted by the first wave of SS raiders. Working together, they repulsed not one, but 2 separate assaults by crack troops from the SS Regiment Deutschland. Luckily for them, the SS hadn't brought any tanks, which made beating them back fairly easy. By the end, more than 100 SS soldiers had been killed in the firefight, with many of them slain by their own countrymen, while only a couple of Americans had been killed or injured. A break in combat then gave Colonel Reed the opportunity to get things going. Soviet T-34 tanks had been spotted, and there was no time to lose. Herded into the back of German and American trucks, corralled between the American tanks, or ridden pell-mell back to the U.S. lines by American Wehrmacht and Cossack officers. One by one, the white Lipizaners and their baby foals were evacuated, just as the Russians were entering the outskirts of Hostau. When the last of the horses had gone, a tense standoff ensued between the Soviets and the Americans. However, the Russians decided it wasn't worth attacking them, and so no more blood was shed that day. Having been whisked away to safety behind U.S. lines, the white Lipizaners were returned to their home at the Spanish Riding School in Austria, where their descendants remain to this day. Later on, After the dust had settled on Operation Cowboy, Colonel Reed explained why he'd risked everything to save them. "We were so tired of death and destruction," he recalled. "So we wanted to do something beautiful."